start. Thank you all for coming in person to this. We've got quite a few people joining us online today, and we're hoping this all goes off smoothly. So yeah, welcome to Australia's first Adoption Literary Festival. We're excited to be a part of this. We had a small working group of people with lived experience joining us on this journey and really steering what today would look like. So thank you to that working group that Jane will speak to more in a moment. So I've spent the last couple of months reading all of the books and looking at the works of the writers that we're featuring today. Really powerful, raw, insightful testimonies of people's personal experience. And I think they, as I read the books, you know, they echoed many of the experiences that we hear from our clients every day at Park. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Sarah Byrne. I'm the manager of the Post-Adoption Resource Centre. And I know many people tuning in today will feel seen and heard as they listen to each of the guests sharing their experiences of adoption. So thank you to our guest hosts, thank you to our panellists who will all be beaming in from across Australia. Thank you to the people who've got up really early or really late in different parts of Australia and the world, and to the gathering here in Glebe who've come in person to watch this event together. We want to thank the New South Wales Forced Adoption Support Service who gave us a grant that has helped really pull this event together, allowed us to pay our speakers, which we think is really important, to honour them and their work, and also the committee, New South Wales Committee on Adoption and Permanent Care, who also gave us some funding for today's event. So I'm going to hand over now to Yvonne Weldon. She is an independent councillor for the City of Sydney and the first Aboriginal councillor in the city's 180-year history. She brings the same audacity, creative energy and fierce optimism to Town Hall that her aunt, Mum, Shirl, brought to her lifelong fight to make Sydney a more just and honourable society. Yvonne is a proud Wiradjuri woman. She was born and raised in the inner city of Sydney, but maintains strong ties to her homelands of Cowra and the riverina areas of New South Wales. A lifelong activist, Yvonne has 30 years experience working in key government and Aboriginal organisations, driving positive reform in health, education and child protection. Yvonne also serves as Deputy Chair of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, Deputy Chair of the New South Wales Australia Day Council, and as a board member of Domestic Violence New South Wales and Redfern Jarjum College. In 2016, she was shortlisted for the Queensland Literary Awards for her unpublished manuscript, 67 Days, and was awarded the 2017 Allen and Unwin Faber Writing Academy Scholarship. 67 Days was published by Michael Joseph in 2022. Sydney Morning Herald reviewer Juliet Hughes claimed the book was more than a romance and that it should be on every book club's list. So thank you, Yvonne. Yvonne will be doing a welcome to me.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, sisters and brothers. As was said, my name is Yvonne Weldon. I am a Wiradjuri woman from Cowra here in New South Wales, from the waters of the Clare, which later became known as the Lachlan, and of the Murrumbidgee rivers. I am a representative of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, who are the culture authority under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act for the land we're on. I would like to pay my respects to all elders, past and present, to all First Nations, to you and the ancestors' lands that you've travelled from. It is always a humbling privilege to provide a welcome to country. For me, it is a profound honour and a luxury of time. Time given by you and time with the many warriors that started the traditions for all of us. A welcome isn't just words, it is a reflection of where we are. Not this modern day place, but the continuous link of life, lessons, purpose and nurturing supplies. The boundaries of our traditional owners are embedded into the earth's natural landscapes. The boundaries of the Eora are the Hawkes River in the north, the Nepean in the west, and the Georges River in the south. On behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, the elders, and the members, I welcome everyone to the lands of the Gadigal. I acknowledge the Gadigal people and also the lands that are represented virtually here today. Across this beautiful continent of ours, there are hundreds of nations, tribes and clans existing here for over 65,000 years, where our songlines are embedded into our DNA from the land and the waterways. The land and the waterways are our life. Without them, our health, our languages, our cultures, ecosystems, our people, and our nations will be diminished. We don't live in isolation of body, culture, spirit, land and water, because we are one. All of us in each of our journeys have been affected by things in life that we don't understand, or we haven't yet got the answers to our questions. To pay homage, could you all please pause for a moment to remember the many sacrifices that have been made along the way, the ones we'll continue to make, and those we shouldn't have to. As we gather here today, please reflect about the people that we have helped along the way, so many that may not realise that we need each other, and also you, what you give to others at the expense of yourself. Let's spare a thought for so many of our friends, our families, and our communities, and what we need to do continuously as a community of people gathered here today. As you connect, learn, and share today, tomorrow, and beyond, we all need to support each other. When there are dark times, light can shine through. We all are that light to each other. Everyone's social and emotional well-being is more important than the material things in this world. Remember, addressing the challenges aren't easy, but we need to take them on with care and with kindness. For the future generation, we can make positive changes. Are we good? No, we all need to support each other, bringing out hidden heartaches to share and bringing us all a strength together, and also to heal together. The road travel alone is the longest, hardest road there is. Don't do it on your own. I can join you and you can. All of us can bring about positive changes to each other now and into the future. To make that future possible, let us all draw upon my people's spirits as we continue on our journey. May my people's spirits walk with you and guide you as we strive forward for us all. Again, on behalf of the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council, welcome to Gadigal land. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Thank you, take care and have a great day.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. That was really beautiful. I just want to welcome Jane Sleeker now. She will be doing the opening address. Jane is a social worker and psychology graduate who has worked in the field of adoption support for the last 15 years across various organisations and roles, assisting those who have been affected by Australia's forced adoption era, as well as more recent domestic adoption practices and inter-country adoption. Jane has written for and edited post-adoption newsletters, co-hosted a podcast, and contributed to the anthology of adoptee stories called The Flourish Experience. Welcome, Jane.
I was on mute. Thank you so much, Sarah. I as well just want to welcome everybody to the inaugural Adoption Literary Festival in Australia. And I would like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the land of the Turrbal and Yagara people in Brisbane. Thank you so much, Yvonne, for your welcome to country. And I just want to echo that and sort of say that in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have cared for this land for over 65,000 years, and also acknowledge the deep loss and trauma that have come and resulted from colonisation. I feel intuitively that many people here today, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can empathise with the deep pain that results from feeling disempowered and in fact overpowered, and having important decisions about one's own life and familial relationships taken away by those with more power. I'm just going to mute, Sarah, the Sydney screen because it's a bit of sound coming through. Yep. In holding a literary festival that focuses on works created by those with lived experience of adoption, we have to acknowledge the social context of adoption in this country. And historically in Australia, women, often young women, and those most in need of support were let down by their system. Their family, community, government and non-government organisations of all kinds, including church institutions and hospitals. As a result, they lost their babies, sometimes having their babies physically removed from them at birth without cause, and in the majority of cases without providing true informed consent. This has come to be known as the forced adoption era in Australia, and Australia was the first country in the world to conduct Senate inquiries and to acknowledge this wrongdoing, and also to issue formal apologies, both from state governments and the federal government in March 2013. And we do know that similar practices occurred in many places in the world, and that wonderfully this year Scotland has followed and provided an apology. And also acknowledge that just in the last week, the Victorian government has been the first government in the world to announce a redress scheme for mothers who experience these practices. And I want to, acknowledge as well that the stories and the literary works that we're going to be discussing today are not just those that are reflective of the forced adoption era, but also later adoptions and inter-country adoptions. And we do acknowledge that many of the factors that underpin inter-country adoptions have many overlaps and similarities and occur because of poverty and lack of social support in other countries. So adoption impacts not only the parents who lose their child and of course the adopted person who experiences grief and trauma lifelong, but also siblings, partners, grandparents, adoption, this festival has been coordinated by the Benevolent Society's Post-Adoption Resource Centre, and in particular Sarah, who just spoke, and I want to acknowledge all of Sarah's hard work in pulling this together on top of what I know is a very big role, and working with us as a working group, which has been a big year, and just I want to acknowledge everybody's dedication and persistence who's been part of that process. So as Sarah said, my name is Jane. I was born and adopted in Queensland in 1987, and I am a social worker who's worked in this space for a while. And the remainder of the working group was made up of writers, so I want to acknowledge all of them. Gwen Wilson, a mother who lost a child to adoption during Australia's forced adoption era, and who has published a biography titled I Belong to No One. And we're looking forward to Gwen joining us in one of the panels later today. And Elizabeth Walton, who is an adoptee who has generously shared both her extensive festival management experience, and Elizabeth's also
Shane, I think you're on mute.
How long have I been on mute for?
A little bit.
No. Okay, I don't know how that happened. Should I start again?
You said that you spoke about Gwen. You spoke about Gwen and then it went on mute.
Okay, great. All right. I don't know why that happened, but that's okay. So I don't know if you caught this bit, but just that we're looking forward to Gwen joining us on one of the panels later today. And then I went on to speak about Elizabeth Walton, also being a member of the working group, who shared her extensive festival management experience, as well as being a writer and having many connections within the literary world. Elizabeth has completed a master's in creative writing where she was awarded the Macquarie University Award for Academic Excellence, and she's currently completing a PhD in creative writing. And the focus of that is on comparing own voices, representations of adoption, with narratives of those that do not have lived experience of adoption. And last but not least, I wanted to acknowledge Michael Grenfell, who was the gentle voice of reason and wisdom throughout the planning process. And Michael is a cross-genre writer and the 2022 Camden Regional winner for poetry in Westword's Living Stories, Things Unsaid. And he's currently working on his memoir. So I also want to acknowledge that the idea for this festival came from a conversation between Sarah Byrne and the late Julia Kaylock, who was an adoptee and poet. And they heard about the fact that an adoption literary festival had taken place in America and thought, why not? Let's give it a go to centre Australian stories. So I want to acknowledge, as a part of the planning process, we did link in with Alice Stevens from the US, who I can see is joining us this morning, which is great. So we want to thank her for her advice and input. And we also want to acknowledge Julia and where this idea came from. And with the permission of her family, I'm going to share one of her poems from a book titled Child of the Clouds, a memoir in verse about adoption trauma and recovery. In line with the aim of the festival, we've intentionally held this festival during Adoption Awareness Month. And consistent with that, Julia actually shares at the beginning of her book that her aim is quite simple. It's to help break down the dominant, often simplistic narrative about adoption. So I'm going to read one of her poems. It starts with, spaces edge their way between the fault lines of memory, creating doubt, blurring the notion of truth, unraveling the ribbons of understanding, dissociating past realities. Yet there is a truth that will not be dissuaded. It is uglier than even I had imagined. Yet at the same time, it is okay, it's bearable, honest and pure. And it is resilient and demanding. It quietly persists that I keep exploring. It will not let the voices win, the ones that say my story is not one for me to tell. It tells me to keep going. This work is important, even if I don't know exactly why. Truth is a force to be reckoned with. It can shapeshift impeccably while maintaining its power, reforming into new and better versions of itself, until its light shines the darkness away, and then, only then, will it extinguish the conditions that brought me to life, that gave me a temporary home, a place to sustain my body through the vernal years. But now its job is clearly of an entirely different trade, applying a blowtorch, exposing fibres of my being, knitting them into a pattern of reason, and arranging a three-part concerto. Here the conductor is ready, tap to begin. Of all of Julia's poems, I read her book this year. This one jumped out at me to be shared at this festival because as in the poem, truth seems to be a central theme that unifies all of the works to be featured today. For individuals and as a community, those impacted by adoption, we know that one of the issues we have grappled with is secrecy, and associated with this shame, which may have been imposed upon us, or for some may have become actually internalized. And I think the vulnerability of sharing one's written work or putting one's truth out there into the world seems to be in direct opposition to secrecy and shame, therefore providing an opportunity for healing, as well as lighting the way for others and letting them know that they're not alone. So whilst carrying great risk, truth-telling can and does heal, unify, and slowly but surely shift the dominant narrative to create a different future and even to correct history. So I'd just like to invite you now to enjoy the day. We're going to commence with a mixed genre panel to be convened by Suzanne Leal, author, experienced facilitator and host of literary events. As the day progresses, we're going to then follow with an in-conversation panel that I'll be hosting, and then a panel of mothers who have written memoirs, and then finishing the day with an adoptee panel. So thank you for joining us today, and I'll hand over to Sarah.
For us. We're now going to have the first panel of the day, the mixed genre panel. As Jane mentioned, Suzanne Leal will be the guest host of this panel. Suzanne is the author of novels The Watchful Wife, The Teacher's Secret and The Deceptions, winner of the NIB People's Choice Prize and shortlisted for the Davitt Awards and the Mark and Everett Moran NIB Literary Award. Suzanne's debut novel for junior young adult readers, Running with Ivan, has been shortlisted for the New South Wales Premier's History Awards, the online host of Thursday Book Club. Suzanne is an experienced facilitator and host at community, corporate and literary events. Our panellists are EJ Clarence. EJ is an emerging writer exploring the long narrative arc of forced adoption through contemporary fiction, narrative non-fiction and poetry. Recent works have appeared in Overland, Adoptee Voices, The Guardian and ABC Ethics. EJ was recently interviewed on the Garrick podcast with Astrid Edwards. We also have Ryan Gustafsson. Ryan is a Korean adoptee writer and researcher living in Nam Land, Melbourne. Their essays have appeared in Against Disappearance, Essays on Memory, Nothing to Hide, Voices of Trans and Gender Diverse Australia, Sydney Review of Books and Liminal Review of Books, among others. They're also co-founder of the Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network and Ibyang In International Network, and one half of the Adopted Feels podcast. We also have Meg OShea. She is a comic maker, educator and research assistant based in Sydney, Australia, Gadigal and Wongal country. She makes largely autobiographical and non-fiction work that has been published both locally and overseas, exhibited comic, animation and film work internationally, and taught comic making to university students, high school age students from migrant and refugee backgrounds with STARTS, and art programs to elementary age students in Korea. As part of the Folio Research Project, she also assists in mapping, archiving and promoting contemporary Australian comics and the diverse artists and communities that create them. We welcome them, and I'll hand over to Suzanne.
Good morning, everybody. Just while we're waiting for cameras to come on for Meg and Ryan and EJ, I just wanted to say how delighted I am to be here today as your host. It's quite an honour, and I'd like to congratulate everybody involved with the Adoption Literary Festival, which is, of course, as you've heard, an Australian first. Big congratulations to the organisers. It's a tough gig to found and to coordinate a literary festival. I know a little bit of that personally. I'm on the board of the Sydney Crime Writers Festival, which is on today and tomorrow as it happens. And it's a lot of work, mostly for the artistic director, but it really requires a lot of thought and a lot of energy, and I'm excited for you. I'd also like to thank Yvonne Weldon for her excellent welcome to country. Fitting that this should be a literary festival. I met Yvonne on a retreat or a fellowship at Varuna, the Writers' Centre, which many of you as creatives might know. And she impressed me then, and she continues to impress me with her work. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, and I too pay my respects to elders past and present, and I'd like to acknowledge that First Nations people were the first storytellers of this land. We've had a lovely introduction from Sarah Burns, and I'd just like to welcome EJ, Meg and Ryan. Now, I'm not an adopted person. My experience of adoption is as a listener and as a reader. In fact, that's my experience of many things. Each of my guests, however, has lived experience of adoption, and they've devoted much of their creative practice to exploring adoption and their own experiences. EJ Clarence, you've heard, was born in Australia and is an adopted person. She's an emerging writer and she explores themes of adoption through contemporary fiction, narrative non-fiction and poetry. Welcome to you, EJ.
Thank you, Suzanne. Hello, everybody.
Ryan Gustafsson, as you've heard, is a Korean adoptee writer and researcher living in Melbourne. I've just been listening to some of his interviews, and he is a very in-depth and thorough researcher who considers not only the practical experiences of adoption but the theoretical theories behind it. And I was fascinated to listen to that. Meg OShea is also a Korean adoptee, and what I love about Meg's works is, as a writer, she brings writing to illustration. So being an illustrator, being a comic maker is, I think in the past, has been such an undervalued gift, in that I think it's, you know how apparently Mark Twain said, I would have written you a shorter letter, but I didn't have the time. And it seems to me that comic making is a bit like that. You need to be able to encompass complex thoughts quickly and in a way that engages both visually and written. But we'll talk about creative practice a little bit further on. Now, given that I come without experience myself of adoption, I understand that some questions can be difficult, and so I'm going to be guided by the three of you as to how these questions might or might not be answered. To give, and I'd like to welcome obviously everybody online and in person in Glebe. For me, coming to this panel, what I wanted to know first of all was individually, what brings you here? What is it about your story that brings you to a festival like this? Can I start with Meg?
Sorry, I just have to make sure I haven't accidentally muted myself. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm a comic maker, and I first started engaging with comic making about the same time I became interested in my personal adoption story. So my personal adoption story is that I was adopted from Korea at 5 months old in 1989. I had been the child of a 19-year-old woman whose boyfriend had left her. You know, at the time, as it still is, like pregnancy outside of marriage was a massive taboo. So she spent some time in a facility owned by my adoption agency and ended up relinquishing me, whatever that may mean. But yeah, that's the history that was on my paperwork, and that's something that I started to look into when I was in my early 20s, just because of a kind of build up of interactions around my race and that kind of thing. And comics seemed to be the best way to deal with that at the time. I'd always been drawing, and you know, I'd been trying to write about these very kind of strange experiences and things I was finding out about myself. But I seemed to always reach a point where words couldn't do what I wanted them to. And as you mentioned, there's kind of like a when you're using visuals, you can summarize things a lot in a certain way and just say things that, well, for me at least, I couldn't with words, and also just kind of document and communicate them. And like through that, I've been able to find a lot of other people, a lot of other adoptees, and people who've been involved with adoption, like the work they make, and like being connected with other adoptees, and it's been really gratifying and that's how I ended up here.
Thank you very
Um,
much. That segues very nicely onto you, Ryan. As I understand, you co-founded the Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network. And it seems to me that from what Meg said, it's important for a community to be found amongst people who've had similar experiences. Can you tell me, first of all, about what you'd like to tell us about your own experience, and then we'll move on to your network itself.
Sure. Can you hear me? I can never tell with Microsoft.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Perfect. Yeah, I was also adopted from South Korea. I was born at the southern end of South Korea, so if anyone knows where Busan is, was born very close to there. I was born to a single mother. She was 19 Korean age, which could be 18 or 19 Western age, who fell ill around the time that I was born. I was relinquished by a relative, so my Korean mother did not provide consent. And my relative that relinquished me was led to believe that I'd be adopted within Korea. So it was quite a surprise when I found them years later, and can't speak their language and know next to nothing about Korea. So yeah, I was adopted to Australia in 1985. And yeah, I think one of the things that brings me to this festival in a way is like, you know, like that sequence of events that I just described about my adoption story. Like, it took years to even get the basic details and to be able to understand that that was part of my history, because of course your paperwork, one, may or may not be true, and you don't know how to verify the details in your paperwork in the first place. And a lot of the things that I learned later about my history was not in fact in my papers at all. So yeah, I guess what's interested me is in the telling of an adoption story, like how much like ambiguity and labor there is to even be able to just sketch out a basic outline. And I think that's one of the things that has really interested me in pursuing writing about adoption through more creative means as opposed to through more academic or research means, is really like being able to explore the sort of affective, like, or emotional, right, aspects of dealing with that level of ambiguity, and relationship to truth, relationship to one's own history. So I became much more interested in perhaps exploring the aspects of the adoption experience that perhaps like an academic perspective might miss or might not be able to really encapsulate. So that's what has brought me here.
And of course, what I might do actually is come back to the network later and turn to EJ. But just before I do so, what's interesting, it must be for you as an academic, dealing with an area where rather than being too much information, which I think in this internet age, we're assailed with information everywhere, you're talking about information that is lacking and how you come to a narrative where there is less rather than too much information. Is that fascinating or frustrating, or both?
That's a good question. I think that's just the set of like social and legal and, you know, material conditions that I think adoptees are left to navigate, right? I don't know any other way, so it's hard for me to say. But yeah, I think trying to parse the absences and understand what can be verified and what can't, and making peace with perhaps one may never know, you know, I think that's all part of what makes adoption like a really interesting thing to explore creatively, I guess.
Thank you. EJ, your experience is quite different. What can you tell us about your experience that brings you here?
Well, I thanks, Suzanne. And obviously my experience is very different to Ryan and Meg's because I was actually born in Australia. But what I love about both Meg's work and Ryan's work is that I haven't read a lot of Ryan's creative nonfiction, but I certainly have read his academic work and Meg's cartoon work, and it's sort of like between the two extremes of their work, there's that sort of theoretical in-depth detail in Ryan's work, and then in very thorough detail, and then in Meg's work a snapshot of it. And I've noticed that the way that they're both approaching their work is really inspiring. My background is of the forced adoption era in Australia, where I think the reason that I write about these experiences is because I've noticed that the actual experience of it is quite different to the story that we are told through the media. And that seems to be, for me, the big point of writing anything about it, because it's actually very hard to write about adoption material, especially if you're writing personal material. It's challenging to get people to understand what you're writing about. It's challenging to have editors understand what you're writing about, but it's also very personally challenging to spend time in that material that is actually quite confronting sometimes. So the purpose for doing it, I think, is to just present a different narrative to the sort of heavily whitewashed rescue narrative that we're told. That Meg, actually, I've noticed, has in one frame of one cartoon has snapped that whole perspective of how we are told that adoption is, it's an act of generosity and kindness. But what happens beyond that? What happens then after we've got that baby and we've taken it out of a difficult circumstance, and then we've got a baby that is actually going to live the rest of its life, and its children and its grandchildren. Everybody is going to live under the umbrella of that incident that happened when that person was a baby or a small child. So the permanence of the implications of an act of adoption go on and on and on throughout our lives, and then are passed on to our children too, because they are raised in the context of a parent that has these confused experiences of childhood and child rearing themselves. So that's sort of my contribution to talking about those experiences.
And I understand you're a parent, EJ. Did that affect your parenting, the fact that you came from a forced adoption era, and you're talking about this generational progression?
Yeah, well, I actually had, like my adopted siblings and family, we all had children very young. We all had children fairly well when we were teenagers, all of us. Some of us were married, some were not. And so we've raised our children in that context. And now our children are having children too. So we're sort of moving towards that grandparent role. But having said that, those issues that were there at the start are still there, because there's fracture lines. And I was thinking about the children, certainly in my context, because I connected with both families very young when I was at high school. So the children then have been raised, and it must be very confusing. Like, how would it be? Like, you would think you're going to be raised as a parent, as a child. You're going to have a parent, a mother, a father, whatever you're going to have. But for my child, it's like, no, my mum has two mothers and two fathers, and there's no hierarchy. It's just two separate families that don't interact, that don't engage. And I wonder what that must have been like to be that child born into that, and just being asked with no explanation, just presented with that circumstance and left to work it out. Because that's kind of effectively what has happened to my generation of forced adoption people. Yeah.
And you referred to your adoption as secret adoption, EJ. What did that mean for you?
Well, yeah, and I don't know. I don't know that this is something that would impact Meg and Ryan as much. The secrecy for their experiences is present, but also not present, because it was a secret. You're not allowed to talk about it at school. You're not allowed to talk about it. Like, I remember being pulled up and brought into the headmaster's office because I had mentioned it at primary school, in infant school. Yeah, so it was a big injunction: do not speak about this. There are other children in our street, there are other children in our suburb, on the bus, in the classroom, but we were not to talk about it. And that's still apparent now. In our families, we're still not allowed to talk about it. So yeah, but that's in addition to the secrecy of documents redacted, information withdrawn and withheld, which still impacts us as well.
Thank you. Ryan, turning to you and to your adoptive parents, what story were you given by them, and what how was the fact that you were an adoptee dealt with within your family, within your adoptive family?
I think for me, like, adoption is just like, when I was like, it's like, it explains how I ended up right in my adoptive family, and I think it was just an explanatory factor, right, for how I ended up there, and I think it was very much, I think this mirrors, I think I'm interested in what EJ thinks too, but like the kind of mainstream understanding that adoption is just an event in the past that doesn't really have much bearing on your present, and doesn't really have like much to do with one's identity. Like, I've come to realize as an adult that being an adoptee is an identity in itself. That kind of understanding was certainly not cultivated. Granted, I don't think my adoptive parents would have thought about adopteeness as an identity either. So, or I've understood that there were communities of adoptees. So I think it was just very much a known thing, but very much spoken about as, yeah, that's just the past, and now you're here, and kind of that's that. I also have other adoptees on my dad's side of the family. So there was a mix of, quote unquote, like biological kids of my extended family, and there were also us adoptees. So adoption, I think, was a concept I would have understood as a child, but again, in that kind of more simple, mainstream way.
If you could change one thing as to how you were raised by your adoptive parents, knowing what you know now, and given this is a different era, is there something that you would change?
It's a hard question. I think like, yeah, I guess the one thing might be, I think just like awareness around the impacts of adoption, I guess, and to be given a language through which to discuss that. I think that would have been powerful. Like, I've reflected on like how there was some sort of language around, being part of the LGBTQIA plus community, even though that was also a bit limited when I was young, but at least there was kind of a general understanding that those are identities, or that is a type of community or a type of minority. I think something perhaps around adopteeness, or the meaning of being adopted as something that is a group-based phenomenon and a group-based identity might have been helpful.
Interesting, the concept of language, because it seems to me that you have spent much of your professional life making that language, and indeed the three of you have in your different creative pursuits. Meg, does that resonate with you, what Ryan said, in terms of not having a language to discuss your identity as you were growing up?
Yeah, definitely in a big way. The kind of environment I was raised in my home growing up was also, again, very much like, you know, adoption is a thing that happened in your past. You're part of this family now. You know, you're 100% Australian right now. You know, that's all there is to it. Like, you know, all that kind of thing. And I think from what I've gathered from going through like documents my parents were given by like various adoption groups and the New South Wales government and the adoption agency at the time, the approach to raising an intercountry adoptee was to kind of not engage with the kind of cultural identity that existed before that in a very like full way. There, you know, and like at the time I was adopted to Australia as well, my parents were, you know, kind of left leaning, so very into ideas of like popular ideas of like multiculturalism at the time, which were kind of like anyone can be Australian and kind of erasing any like kind of cultural differences to an extent. So I didn't really grow up with any kind of language to even talk about myself as Asian, really. And that's something that I found like very, very difficult. Just growing up, particularly as, you know, I got older, I left high school, I made new friends, and I interacted with like a broader range of people who were constantly reminding me that I wasn't like, you know, I wasn't the kind of white Australian I had been essentially raised to be by my parents, whether they intended that or not. Also kind of growing up that issue of, you know, speaking about adoption being a taboo that's already been brought up so eloquently. That growing up, like, you know, not having the language for that as a child, but then like growing up with like the adult understanding of like the sensitivities around engaging with that with your parents, kind of like, you know, understanding that, you know, I was adopted because my parents had kind of reproductive issues, understanding that, you know, if I was to talk about it with them, that would also bring up all of these kind of still very unresolved things for them as well. So there just seemed to be no space or really other people that I even could try to form language or borrow language from growing up until I met other adoptees through making comics. Or,
Mm.
Yep.
So Meg, you're talking about sort of growing up, making new friends. So how would the conversation go that would leave you without a language? Would people, if you were met with your adoptive family, were questions intrusive? Were the questions difficult? How did you deal with that, meeting new people and them asking how you place yourself or where you place yourself?
Yeah, it'd I just try and very quickly divert the conversation. If it was kind of someone in a friendly social context, you know, if it was a new potential friend who was like from a kind of diverse cultural background, there probably would be a question. It's like fairly early on about like, oh, you know, where are you from? And I'd have to say, oh, Korea, but, and then like, you know, try and explain this full thing of adoption history without seeing like this complete weirdo meeting a new person. But I think more frequently, like the things that stuck with me would just be like, you know, just very, very random interactions where, like, you know, my race was seen as like a kind of obvious and a negative thing to people. And those were more the sorts of things that like kind of affected me, I think, after a while. And yeah, I kind of went off a bit off track there.
That's really instructive. Ryan, I want to talk to your description of yourself as being a Korean adoptee rather than a Korean Australian. Why do you make that distinction?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I like really consciously made that decision when writing the bio, but I think I don't know. I guess like Korean adoptee feels like I feel more strongly connected to that, I suppose. I don't know. I think I don't want to get too into it, but I think like in the research that I've been doing too, like I think there's a lot of hesitation, I suppose, when claiming like a quote unquote hybrid identity. And I think the fact of adoption is like it signifies something that comes to complicate a kind of hybrid identity like Korean Australian. Like for me personally, that adoption or adopteeness does something to those terms that makes it that slightly, you know, changes the contours of that experience. I think Korean Australian also, like I suppose it is factually true, but as a category of identity, I'm not sure that I feel particularly drawn to it as something that speaks to my experience.
Thank you. The network that you co-founded is called the Korean Adoptee Adoption Research Network. Can you tell me about its genesis and what you set out to do?
Sure. It was basically founded during COVID, when we realized like, well, everyone's meeting on Zoom. So the fact that the two other people that I work with are based in Korea, they're also Korean adoptees, but they live long-term in Korea. The fact that they were based there wasn't as much of a barrier as it might have been during quote unquote normal circumstances. So we decided like, yeah, it can feel kind of, I don't know how others on the panel feel, but like it can feel pretty isolating to be doing research on Korean adoption as a Korean adoptee or adoption research as an adoptee. And we felt like it would be nice to create some sort of low-key forum for interested people to come along and share what they're working on. So yeah, that's basically the objective. And I think because the other co-founders live in Korea, I think they also have access to a lot more Korea-specific research and activities. And so we kind of are trying to use that as a strength to be able to like, you know, the ideal would be to like be able to form collaborations with Korean researchers who are also looking at adoption, and bridge some of those barriers, because I think I've come to realize like there's so much about Korean adoption history and practices that like we as overseas adoptees, like we are not going to be able to access and understand. Like we really need allies in Korea who are also doing that work, and we need translation, and we need to work together to build a clear and more robust picture of the phenomenon.
Thank you. It seems, speaking to the three of you, that you each as children took on enormous responsibility. So this responsibility of providing answers to people, of protecting your adoptive parents, of keeping secrets. EJ, I'd like to turn to you about that. Did you feel as a child that you had a weight of responsibility, and what was that responsibility?
It was a sense of being lost. I'm also the youngest in my my adopted family. I'm the youngest, so it was sort of like I was already in a group of people who already had their little structures set up, so I just sort of bought into it. We're all pretty close in age, but it was a very sort of almost a humorous, cynical look at, like, this is all a bit of a joke, really, isn't it? It's all a bit strange. Yeah, but I think that the thing that makes it even more confusing is that when we, touching on something that Ryan said, when we then reach out, even now in adulthood, to other people with similar experiences, one of the things that has really become apparent to me over the last couple of years is that there isn't an experience of adoption. There are each person is almost inside their own little silo of adoption experience that has very little in common with each other person's experience of adoption. And that seems to really reinforce the fact that we cannot get together as a group that can put together a common voice, in the sense that some marginalised identities can. And it's, I think that the further I've looked into it, it's because of the very, very different experiences and different ways that it's all gone down. And I think that I really love that Ryan has got the writing group. One of the powerful things that I've found has been really helpful has been joining up with Adoptee Voices, which is run by Alice, who is here. Hello, Alice. Because it brought together people from Australia, but also people from all over the world with all these different experiences. And it starts to sort of become apparent that there is a way of creating space for each voice, even though those voices don't, they don't even have, like, if you're an adopted person, the minute that your sibling meets up with their adopted, their biological family, if you like, is the minute that it is totally reinforced that every single person in that triad's experience is completely different. There is no commonality for any of you, even inside the same family. So doing what you can to accept that and acknowledge that, and then hook up with other people who are exploring their own personal view of that, is, I think, really powerful. So hats off to all the people who are setting up these very vital, important groups worldwide that cross over international barriers.
Can I take you all back to something that EJ just said, which is really that you're in a silo? It seems to me, as a writer and I suppose as a creative person, most of other writers or creative people I know see themselves as observers, and it's the observer part of you that enables you to create. Another way of saying being in a silo and trying to make sense of that silo. Meg, what does your creative practice mean for you in understanding yourself?
Yeah, it means a lot. I think just, in my personal practice, I think, like, I'm, as you may have been able to tell from this, I'm the sort of person who gets very, very easily, like, confused and occasionally overwhelmed when it comes to sort of, like, thinking about and articulating things like particularly very complex things to do with adoption and my personal experience with that. And I think comic making, one of the reasons I really stuck with it was it gave me the opportunity to kind of sit with things in a way that I could control by putting certain things into a narrative form, or even as a means of kind of like documenting kind of new and terrible things I'd found out about, like the processes that had like brought me to be where I am. It kind of gave a way it provided me with a way to make sense of these things, and then also like having things in like a kind of coherent format also kind of had that maybe not secondary, but kind of like, you know, parallel goal of like, oh, you know, like I've gone through this like often like quite kind of very painful and upsetting process of finding out these things and articulating these things about myself, and that sits in opposition to the broader social narratives I grew up with. So this can be a thing that is there that might do something to kind of like trouble that narrative, or like show the complexity of that, and like, you know, that like that might be a way for like, you know, other people who've had similar experiences to maybe not have to go through that in their silo either, to an extent, maybe. Yeah.
That's instructive. I write fiction rather than non-fiction, and you know, writing a novel takes a while, and you need to be interested, because if you get bored, you know, after a couple of pages, it's a long go to another 400. So for me, it's a hook, and generally the hook is some issue that I can't quite resolve myself, and I put it into a creative practice because I think it gives me the distance and it gives me the place to think. Can see you nodding, EJ. What does your creative practice offer you?
Yeah, that's a really interesting thing. And I think that goes back to the topic of names, because for me, a huge part of my creative practice is working out what name to write under. And I have a birth certificate that says unnamed. And so I've actually tried writing under that name. And when I did that, suddenly I had a freedom and access to write about these experiences that I've been told all my life, no, you must not mention that. You can't even talk about it. You can't even think about it. It didn't happen, you know, don't talk about it. So to sort of then write with that enormous injunction is almost impossible, because you know, every writer has got that sort of, you know, saboteur or the inner voice saying whatever. You've got to deal with this also huge stated fact that you can't talk about it. And it's on a very subtle level. It's not like a government saying you can't talk about it. It's the people that are closest to you that are saying don't talk about it. So for me, writing under a different name, I started writing under unnamed, which is what the name is on my birth certificate, on one of them. And that gave me immediate access to writing in a much more powerful way and more unified way. And I'm very interested in, you know, some of the work that's coming out in contemporary writers. It's not victim writing at all. It's much more powerful, taking the conversation to elevating it to a much more powerful place. Where we are actually empowered and the center of our stories, as opposed to something that happened to us being what is the powerful element that is controlling our lives. So, you know, to me, that's what I'd like to see happen with all of us as writers, is to be able to, you know, explore it from a very more, a place that has more permission for us to speak. Yeah.
It's interesting. I used to judge the New South Wales Premiers Awards. I sort of oversaw the panels. And what I noticed over those years was that, particularly in the Multicultural Award, the writing by diverse writers went from earlier this gratitude of Australia being the lucky country to a narrative of criticism and really digging into what the experience was in this country. And it seems to me, EJ, that what you're saying is that, and what I've read from your other work, Megan, Ryan, is that the narrative of being grateful to have been rescued and to be put in a family is something that the creatives are starting to break down. Does that, have I misunderstood that, Ryan, or is that correct, do you think?
I would, yeah, I guess, like, I think the gratitude, the rescue discourse, I think, imposes like a gratitude imperative, I think, on adoptees, whether or not that's like conscious or not, right? Like, I think I don't even dare go into the realm of psychology or whatever, but I think like that would have, you know, an impact, right, on one when they like growing up, right? Like, even if your parents aren't saying that, like you are, right, obviously enmeshed in a particular context where that is the dominant understanding or the dominant story. Yeah, I think what I am trying to, like, I guess as an emerging writer, like, what interests me is also to try and like what kind of writing can I create that isn't necessarily orienting itself toward dismantling something, and instead trying to just write the things that, you know, I'm interested in, or that, you know, I wish like I had explored when I was a bit younger, or yeah, I suppose like not having really grand ambitions for my writing to like speak to a really large audience. I guess I've just been trying to yeah, explore these issues really for myself, and I think getting them down on the page is a way to understand them better for myself. That's been my aim, I guess, and it's been nice that some of the stuff I've written has seemed to resonate with people, and that's great. But yeah, I think it's very disorienting, like even as a researcher, right, to figure out how to position yourself and the so-called contribution you're trying to make within this larger corpus, and like the loudest voices may not be the ones that, you know, is it worth your time and energy to be really going after that, given you know, or could you could other things happen if we're not so beholden, I suppose, to the opinions and discourses that non, quote unquote, mainstream or non-adopted people have. I'm sorry, that really wasn't an answer.
No, look, and I think it was an answer, and I think what it shows is the very differing creative practice between you in mixed genre. In this, for you, Ryan, it seems this this establishment of a theoretical basis of this secrecy and this identity that's only really now being explored more seriously and perhaps more academically. Meg, you've written about the issue of once having had a different name, but one you don't know. How does that feel, the fact that you had a name, but it was not provided to you?
Yeah, so my original Korean name that's on my Korean documentation was actually provided to me by my adoptive parents. But I think in terms of like knowing it, I think this is maybe something that also might resonate with a lot of other Korean adoptees, like that was that was my first interaction with Korean language. And, you know, I didn't even realize that the way my parents had been pronouncing it to me was like completely incorrect until I started learning Korean. And for me, it just kind of represents a very kind of clear break in between like these kind of two very separate identities I'd had, which had been like broken off through this legal process. And you know how kind of like the very wide gap between like those two that would need to be reconciled or contended with. I think like, yeah, one thing I've seen a lot with a lot of other Korean adoptees, like one of the first questions people might ask is like, this used to be my name, does anyone know how to say it? Does anyone know what it means? And, you know, names, your name is you. It's the thing you go through the world with and like interact with other people through, and it's just like such a huge thing to be kind of just separated from. And yes, it trailed off again.
And where is that name? Where is the Korean name that you were given? Where do you place it now? Do you place it as a thought? Do you ever write it? Do you ever use it? Where is it within you?
That's a good question. I lived in Korea for a couple of years. And I think living in Korea and just occasionally kind of just passing for a local Korean, I did actually start thinking of myself under my original Korean name occasionally. And also because, you know, I had a Korean teacher who would call me my Korean name just so we could practice like speaking and that kind of thing. So I think in my mind, at least, my name represents a version of myself, and being back in Australia, it's not necessarily a version of myself that just feels very me at the moment, but it definitely represents a part of myself, and also like a very kind of what if alternate dimension version of myself that's out there somewhere. Don't know if it's too early to get into alternate dimensions, but
is this something that you have or wish to explore in your comic making, in your creative art?
Yeah, certainly. Like I think one of the things that appeal to me particularly about like the comics medium is that you can on one page show kind of like multiple realities and multiple times and multiple existences simultaneously very, very easily. And I think that kind of consolidating all of those different versions of yourself is like a big part of my practice. And, you know, my original Korean self, my alternate universe Korean self, is definitely a huge part of that. So yeah.
Thank you. EJ, you've said it wasn't until 2020 at the age of 52 that I was given the right to use my name. What were you meaning by that?
Well, in fact, I don't even know that I was given the right to use my name. The New South Wales state government and the Victorian state governments both introduced integrated birth certificates. And the paperwork associated with those birth certificates made it quite clear that once those certificates were issued, the fact sheets and the legislation say that you then actually have the right to choose whichever of those you wish to use. What that means is not what I've actually written. What it means is that you've got the right to choose whichever piece of paper you wish to use, but it still doesn't give you the right to use the actual name. So in fact, the whole issue of integrated birth certificates is, I mean, it was nice to receive an integrated birth certificate. So for example, on the integrated birth certificate, I saw my sibling's name for the first time written on a birth certificate, and that actually brought me to tears. Yeah, so because, you know, my sibling is adopted, but the thing is my sibling is my sibling, and for some reason that was the most powerful part of seeing the integrated birth certificate. It was not even seeing my mother's name next to, well, my mother and my mum, you know, both of them next to each other on the same piece of paper. It was really challenging. But there was still a priority in the birth certificates. There's not supposed to be a priority in the birth certificates. But even with having the names next to each other, there still is a legal priority and a social priority. So it's still very confusing, and I don't really know what the answer is to any of that, apart from to say that in the future, you know, these issues can be addressed, and that people who are presently living in these experiences can have this addressed by their communities, legally, socially, and, you know, family-wise.
Thank you, EJ. Just in the 2 minutes we've got left, Ryan, as an academic, what would you say, or do you have thoughts on the importance of a name? Why is a name important?
I don't know if I can answer that as an academic. I mean, I think I like what Meg said resonates a lot with me. I think the only thing I would add is that I think it also, you know, it matters who names you as well. Like, and I think for me, I when I started searching for my Korean family, one of the first questions I had was like, who gave me the name that appears on my paper? And finding out that it was just created by the adoption agency was actually quite, was probably, yeah, conjured up, I guess, some of our emotions and frustrations, because I think that prior to then I had always assumed for some reason that my name was given to me by my Korean family. I didn't consider that an agency worker would have just created a name for me. They also created my family origin, which is actually it has nothing to do with where I was actually born. So on paper, my family origin is Hanyang, which is the old name for Seoul, and I was not born in Hanyang. So I think that changed things, and then I think that's also like one of the aspects of the, you know, the impacts of adoption. Like the more that you learn and the more that you explore, it does retroactively change things too about like your sense of yourself from before. And I think knowing that my Korean last name, which is now part of my legal name, because my parents also retained it, knowing that that name is actually not the name of my Korean mother, it's the name of my supposed Korean father. I probably would prefer to have taken her name, you know, so I think it just, yeah, it just has brought up, yeah, I think it signifies, I guess, something about, yeah, all the like bureaucratic processes that we've had to go through, and the impacts of that.
Thank you so much. Look, we've come to the end of the session. Can I thank you, Ryan and EJ and Meg, for such a generous session. Thank you for asking questions that were often quite personal and required some reflection. It's certainly been very instructive for me, and I'm sure for the audience that are with you both in person in Glebe and online. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to you, Suzanne. Some really big questions there for this panel and really interesting discussion. Thank you, Meg. Thank you, EJ. Thank you, Ryan. We will close this session now, and for those of you joining us in the next session, which is the conversation with Susanna McFarlane and Robin Luber on their book Heartlines, The Year I Met My Other Mother. We will see you in the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us.